welcome this evening to our series Gandhi Matters. This is the 18th in the series which we started. Unfortunately, the past 2 years we have to suspend, not because there's a lot of suspension of Gandhi going on in India, but because we believe that he is irrepressible and that we have to continue to explore him. We are particularly happy that today is the day when the Dandi March came to an end. Or did he lift it? Yeah. So it's very appropriate that we remember that. When Gandhiji, I am very fond of saying this and I have said it many times, that when he lifted this little, how many? 23 grams of salt, it was also the beginning of the end of the British Empire. In about 20 years from then, the British Empire was more or less demolished from the world. So it's a very momentous historic moment, and there are many stories about what happened on the way. I will just tell you one of them, which I'm very fond of, and I keep on, whenever I have an opportunity to speak to younger people, I narrate that story. It seemed that he reached a village by dusk. There was a river, a small river, which had to be crossed. It was very muddy, so it could not be walked through, and it was shallow, so it could not be navigated. So it was decided that by about 12 midnight, some water will come, because it was very close to the sea, and then Gandhiji and the 70-odd satyagrahis would cross the river in a boat. Gandhiji took out his watch and went into a hutment, went off to sleep. But these villagers, who were mostly illiterate, very poor, quite aware of the fact, if the British come to know that they have in any case, in any manner helped Gandhiji or this march, there will be unfortunate repercussions for them. But they started wondering how they can allow, it's a dark night, how can they allow Gandhiji to cross the river without some light? So, when Gandhiji came out at 12, this is what has happened. There were hundreds of these poor, illiterate farmers standing with earthen lamps in their hands. And the word has gone around, it has gone across to the next village where he was to go, and they were also standing. Ladies and gentlemen, it's like a biblical episode. Imagine a man with 75 walking, taking a march, defying the British government, and here are peoples who could not do anything else but at least stand with lights in their hands. This is there are other episodes, but I'm sure friend Anuj would have tell us more. He seemed to be a man of many parts, as they say, because he started studying finance in Middlesex University, London, and worked briefly as an equity researcher before taking up photography. He works in diverse genres in the medium and has a number of solo and group exhibitions to his credit in India as well as internationally. His works have been published in various art and photographic journals in India and abroad. He has authored a book called 23 Grams of Salt, Retracing Gandhi's March to Dandi, that has received wide critical acclamation. Ambalal had no formal training in photography. He lives in Ahmedabad, where he also follows his other passion, furniture design. In fact, this talk was scheduled much earlier, but then the second wave of the came in between. But we are fortunate that it is now taking place on a day which is a historic day. So, Anuj Ambalal.
Good evening, everyone. Before we begin this evening, I would like to thank Ashokji and the Raza Foundation for inviting me here. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank in particular one friend of mine from Delhi who believed very strongly in my Dandi project and was of great help. So many thanks to Manu Parekh, he is here somewhere. Thank you, sir. It indeed is an honor to be a part of this series that is titled Gandhi Matters. Actually and very strangely, there has been a question that has been doing round these days in various forms and in various actions. But essentially, the question is, does Gandhi matter? And today, after this talk, I hope to articulate on the reasons as to why Gandhi matters, more so today than ever before. Today I'll be sharing with you some stories from my recent body of work. The series is titled 23 Grams of Salt. It is a photo documentation of sites pertaining to the Dandi Marsh that was undertaken by one Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi in 1930. As you all know, that the march commenced from the Sabarmati ashram and ended in Dandi. And my series predictably starts from Hriday Kunj and ends at the Selfie Villa. But importantly, I think it covers everything that falls in between these two markers. And by everything I mean the sites where these marchers ate or rested, prayed, the buildings in which they stayed, may it be the dharamshalas, schools, the routes that they'd taken, the landscapes that they might have seen, and the villages through which they passed. I've also tried to locate with some success some of the trees under which Gandhi had prayed or wrote letters. So all this forms a part of the visual narrative of the march as it exists today. And as a part of the 90th anniversary celebrations of this march, Navjeevan Trust, an institute founded by Gandhi, had published a book on this series. The book is titled 23 Grams of Salt, and it has text and pictures related to this series. Before I start with the slideshow, I would like to speak a bit about the Salt March. I mean, what exactly was this Salt March? I mean, we all know that it was the fulcrum of the Indian independence movement, because it was with this that Gandhi unleashed the civil disobedience movement. We also know that it was the first instance where there was mass participation by women into the freedom struggle. But the question that I ask is, are we looking at the complete picture? Was the Salt March just a political campaign? Because if that is the case, then the march has to be labeled as a failure, because the salt laws were not repealed and independence came 17 years after. So how should we look at it? I think Gandhi's remark sheds a very good light behind the intentions of this march. Gandhi said that the civil disobedience movement that was triggered by the Salt March was not designed to gain independence, but it aimed to empower the people with the means to do so. So in other words, Gandhi was trying to trigger a social revolution which in turn he hoped would initiate the political revolution. And all these stories will be evident from the histories that I'm about to share with you through the slides. And at the end of the talk, if any of you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. Can we, yeah. This is the front gate of Hriday, Gandhi's home inside the Sabarmati ashram. Gandhi famously took an oath to not return back to the ashram unless independence was won. So on the 12th of March 1930, in the morning as he would have left the ashram, this would have been, it would have been the last time he saw this gate. The area inside Gujarat Vidyapeeth. The Salt Marsh campaign was actually an immaculately planned campaign. Nothing was left to randomness. There were great apprehensions about arrests being made on the morning of the march itself. And to counter this, the organizers had arranged for an entire batch of reserve marchers in case the first batch got arrested. So the area that you see is by which this reserve cohort of marchers waited. Gandhi sets off from the ashram. About 3-4 kilometers away is the Gujarat Vidyapeeth, where he meets these people, and from here he begins his march. This is Lakshman Singh Chavda, who walked behind the marchers from the Sabarmati ashram. He walked till a point in Ahmedabad, which is known as the Income Tax Circle, and it was from here that Gandhi requested the crowds to turn back. Lakshman Singh used to work as a security guard at the Sarabhai residence. He met Gandhi on a couple of occasions. Today I won't digress into those stories. I'll stick to the stories of the march. But one thing stood out when I met Lakshman Singh. Lakshman Singh was well above 100. He was suffering from advanced dementia. But the moment he started talking about Gandhi, I could see a physical change take place in him. The few moments that he had spent with Gandhi are the only memories that survived. And I could see life enter into his eyes when he spoke about Gandhi. And after he finished talking, he would gradually sink back into his state. And this is something that I have noticed in all the 4 witnesses that I met and interacted with. Unfortunately, Lakshman Singh passed away before this book got published. Chandola Lake, site of Gandhi's first speech of the march. This area was a secluded place. Now it is a part of the ever-growing city of Ahmedabad. It is surrounded by industries. It is not as scenic as it appears in the picture, because that is not a fog that you are seeing. It is actually pollution. 90 years back, there was neither this pollution, nor was there any water in the lake. And as the 80 satyagrahis, along with the huge crowds, started walking on what essentially was a dust bowl, dust started to engulf them. It started sticking onto the bodies and the faces of the perspiring satyagrahis. And as the layer of grime increased, it became increasingly difficult to make out the marchers from the crowds, and thus a chaos ensued. People started overtaking the marchers, and it was only after the marchers washed themselves in the muddy waters of this lake was order restored. Field on the outskirts of the village of Vasna. 90 years back, this used to be a mango grove, and Gandhi's satyagrahis rested here. 90 years after, there is just one mango tree that survives, and coincidentally, it is the tree under which Gandhi rested. The gentleman in the screen is the owner of the field, and his grandfather hosted Gandhi. The speech that Gandhi gave in the village of Vasna, he got angry, and there's a story. Gandhi, as we all know, was a great reader of situation and a great reader of people. And the scenic venue that was allotted to them, Gandhi was very suspicious of the intentions behind being allotted this place. He was suspicious because there were Dalits traveling with him, and this is what he conveyed to the villagers, that he would have rather preferred to stay in this village school than to stay in a scenic mango grove. And this is the school that Gandhi mentioned. This is the route of the march. The pictures from the in the next section will come from the regions that are marked. I will periodically share with you this map so that you can get an idea with regards to where we stand. Route taken by the marchers to enter into the village of Daban. The marchers enter the village from one end, and the dharamshala, where they are supposed to stay, is on the other end of the village, where there is a reception party waiting to receive Gandhi. Gandhi approaches the dharamshala, but instead of stopping, he continues walking. He walks past the reception party, and everyone is puzzled what is going on. It was only Gandhi who knew the plan. So he walks for about a kilometer ahead, enters into the Dalit quarters of the village, which was the segregated section outside the village. 90 years after, it still is the same way. So he enters into the quarters, draws water from the well, takes a bath, and then walks back to the dharamshala. The house that you see is built on the site of the well from which Gandhi drew water. The well dried about a few decades back, and subsequently this house was built on top of it. Dharamshala in the village of Daban. These are the stone remnants that you can see that are from the old Dharamshala. Now a new concrete building stands in its place. During my interaction with the villagers at Daban, I came across a very interesting piece of information. The villagers told me that ever since Gandhi's visit, as a mark of respect for Gandhi, whenever there is a death in the village, irrespective of caste, creed and religion, the dead body is first brought to this dharamshala, after which it is taken for the final rites. It is a tradition that is being followed even today. The Boryavi Dharamshala one of the best preserved sites on the entire route. The corridor that you see is by which the marchers took rest. This is the long room on the first floor of the Buryavi Dharamshala. And on the far end, Gandhi took rest after having a meal of khichdi and rotlo. Now, right throughout the march, the British government had deployed plain-clothed policemen, and their job was to follow the marchers and periodically file reports to state the progress the march was making and the impact it was having on the crowds. The Buryavi report states that Gandhi looked fatigued and suffered from low fever due to strain of walking. This is inside the Charottar Education Society in Anand. The new building is built on the site of the smaller school in which Gandhi slept. There are two incidents that happened on this site, and both of these incidents give a very good insight into the spirit in which this march was conducted. One of the marchers, Sumangal Prakash, was taken ill here. He was diagnosed with smallpox. Gandhi goes to meet him and he inquires if Prakash wanted to turn back. Prakash recited his oath of not turning back till Swaraj was won. This would have pleased Gandhi to a great deal. Gandhi granted him a permission to join him after and if he recovered. Prakash eventually recovered and joined the march at Bharuch. The other incident happened on the morning when it was time for them to depart from this site. The 79 marchers were late by 1 minute, and Gandhi spoke to them very sternly, reminding them about the importance of punctuality for this satyagraha. This is the tree that was planted to mark Gandhi's visit to the school. J.D. Patel High School, formerly known as the King Edward's High School. This is where Gandhi took rest in the village of Borsar. Unlike what you see in the picture, this school is still a thriving institute imparting education to girls. It so happened that my first trip to this place was on a public holiday, which is why you see the deserted corridors. Life inside the historic village of Ras. Now, Ras played a very important role in the Namak Satyagraha that followed the march. More than 200 people were arrested from this village. Why was that? This march was immaculately planned, and Sardar Patel is widely acknowledged to be the chief architect of this march. He was the one who charted the route that Gandhi should follow because of his experiences with the Borsar Satyagraha and the Bardoli Satyagraha that were very successful prior to this. And he was visiting these villages to campaign for this march. This was before the onset of the march, of course. And as he reached this village of Ras, the villagers prompted Patel to speak. The British government had imposed a ban on his public speaking, and as soon as he got up, he got arrested. This is the reason why you don't see pictures of Patel in the march. The people of Ras took it up to them and to make amends for being the reason of this arrest, they joined Gandhi Satyagraha with doubled vigor. This is the Ras Dharamshala. As you can see, the new building stands in place of the old one. This is the banks of River Mahi on the outskirts of the village of Kankapura. This picture is taken in the early 80s by an Australian researcher called Thomas Webber. Dr. Webber traveled to India as a young researcher in the early 80s. He walked on the route of the march, followed the same itinerary. In many instances, he stayed in the same places where Gandhi had stayed. And most importantly, interviewed 21 of the surviving marchers. So a lot of what we know about the march that is there in the public domain is largely because of his research. He's written a beautiful book which is titled On the Salt Marsh, and this was the basis of my work, because I read this book somewhere around in 2012 and it really inspired the curiosity inside me to undertake this whole journey and to see how these places look. So wherever I could identify, he sent me some pictures upon my request, and wherever I could identify the place, I have included the picture in my slide talk today. This is how the exact place looks today. In some places you see that a great change has come, and in a few places you feel as if Gandhi would have walked out of this place about 3 hours back. This is Fateh Singh Parmar, who as a child saw Gandhi inside his village of Kankapura. When I asked him to describe Gandhi, he said Gandhi was a very tall man with an enormous head. This is on the other side of the river Mahi. This was the toughest trek for the marchers on the entire route, and this is because they had to wait till midnight for the tide to come in so that the boats could be brought closer. For that they had to walk in knee-deep sludge both ways. So by the time they reach this end and they cross the sludge, arrive at this beach, it was 2 in the morning. They clean themselves up, and by 2:30 they get to sleep. At 4 a.m., Gandhi rattles a spoon against a metal bowl and wakes them up. It was time to prepare for the departure. It was on this beach that Nehru unites with Gandhi, and as they walk to the next destination of Kareli, they hold consultations. This is the Jinning mill of Kareli. The room on the left of your screen is where Gandhi stayed, and the room on the right of the gate is where Nehru rested. The concrete plinth that you see in front of your picture is from which Nehru gave a short speech to the villagers. Inside Gandhi's room at Kareli, Gandhi's speech site in the village of Annexe. This is how it looked in 83. This is how it looks today. The cabin that you see beyond the banyan tree is built on the site where a temporary hut made out of dry leaves and grass was made for Gandhi. This is on the outskirts of the village of Annexe. This is Dulaji Bagri. a resident of Anki. Tulaji, as a young child, was called when it was time for Gandhi to have his meal. Tulaji milked a goat for Gandhi. The Jambusar Jinning mill, a very important site in the context of this march. And because it was here that the only meeting of the Congress Working Committee was held. This was during the march. Important leaders like Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal, Sarojini Naidu, Dr. Ansari, all the top Congress brass met Gandhi here, and the agenda was to debrief the top leadership in case Gandhi got arrested before the completion of the march. This is how it looks from the inside. As you can see, it is now totally abandoned. The peepal tree under which Gandhi rested in the village of Bua. The village of Bua holds a very peculiar position in the history of the march, and that is because it was one of the few villages in which Gandhi was not welcome. The story goes that the village elders, they feared the government reprisals and were not too keen to host Gandhi, while the younger generation held contrary views, and so there was this clash between the two generations. And to make matters worse, on that particular day, the dharamshala that was reserved for the marchers was actually reserved by a wedding party. So as a part of a compromise, the marchers had to vacate this dharamshala earlier than they would have liked. Gandhi was reportedly very angry with the arrangement. This is how the village looks. Gandhi's speech site in Bua, where a low turnout was recorded. As Gandhi reaches this site, a lady from the village approaches to apply tilak to Gandhi, but Gandhi refuses. Gandhi refused because the lady had not worn khadi. And it is said that since then, for the rest of her life, the lady wore khadi. The dharamshala in the village of Tralsa, as you can see, it is being used as a warehouse today. The area where Gandhi rested in the dharamshala, subsequently it got converted into a Gandhi Mandir. I came across 2 such mandirs on the route. The cottage inside Sevashram Ashram in Bharuch. This is where the marchers took rest. By the time the march reaches Bharuch, it has received great media attention, and by now the eyes of the entire nation are riveted towards its progress. This is the dental clinic inside the Sevashram Ashram that was established by Dr. Chandulal Desai. It was a charitable institute, and Dr. Chandulal Desai was Gandhi's host. This is how the clinic looked in '83. Gandhi took rest on the room on the first floor on the extreme right. This is how the clinic looks today. Staircase that Gandhi used to reach his room. As the marchers reached this clinic, a medical checkup was conducted on them, and in a letter to Miraben, Gandhi mentions of having gained 2 pounds during the march. The route taken by the marchers in Bharuch to reach the river Narmada that they were supposed to cross on boats there's an old book in Gujarati which I used for my references, in which there is a very evocative piece of writing that describes how huge crowds had lined up this road on both sides, and from these very balconies, rose petals were being showered on the marching Mahatma. This is a site inside the village of Raima. The large house on the left, on the first floor, it's a one single hall where the 79 marchers rested. The smaller house on the right is where Gandhi rested. This house belonged to Nathuram Kashiram, who was known to be a fearless satyagrahi. Nathuram was once leading a non-violent protest, and the police resorted to a lathi charge. Nathuram refused to take a backward step, and while he clung on to a lamp post, 80 blows of lathis were showered on him. Nathuram loses consciousness. After a while, when he comes back to his senses, he declared his intentions of continuing with this protest and was finally arrested. So this was the kind of courage that was required of people who wanted to either host these marchers or support them in any way. This is how the section of Nathuram Kashiram's house looks today. The other half has been demolished and a new building stands where his descendants stay. Inside the long hall where the rest of the marchers took rest. Now, right throughout my own journey, I was very keen on locating and photographing objects that were touched by Gandhi during the march. And it turned out to be a very difficult task than I had imagined. From my research, I knew that Gandhi required shave at various points in the march. And he required a shave in Raima. And thus, the barber, village barber, was summoned. Nathuram was the barber who was called, and in the few minutes that he had spent shaving Gandhi, so inspired was he that he donated 3 acres of his ancestral land to the national cause. His descendants, I was trying to locate them, but they had left the village and relocated to some city. After a search of 6 months, I was able to locate his son, the one that you see in the picture, Babubhai Vadan, with the help of a journalist friend. Upon my request, he came down to his father's house in Raima. And this is the razor that his father used to shave Gandhi. A small school in the village of Patkam. A lot of drama took place in this very serene looking small building. All of us have had days where nothing goes right for us. The 18th day of the march was one such day for Gandhi. He wakes up at 3 in the morning. The night stay was at a village called Erthan. He goes out of his hut and sees the women of the village. It's a small village. The women of the village cooking food for the marchers at 3 in the morning. And he would have cringed with the sight of this. Later on in the day, instead of the few line pieces that Gandhi required, He was served with oranges and grapes. He noticed that he was the only one who was being served milk, and no one else in the village was using milk. So Gandhi makes his inquiries, and he comes to know that the fruits and the milk have been procured from the city of Surat, which was about 30-35 kilometers, and brought to him in a car. This was a great extravagance for Gandhi. He further notices that the usual cup in which he served his milk changed. So again he makes his inquiries and comes to know that his old cup was broken and 2 new cups were procured, one as a reserve. By now Gandhi gets really angry. The march starts and they reach on the outskirts of this village of Patkam. It was late evening, it got dark, and in their enthusiasm to please Gandhi, the reception party that had gone out to greet him took with them 2 laborers, and their job was to carry heavy Petromax lamps on their heads. That, as they say, was the final stroke on the camel's back. Gandhi increased his pace because he did not want to see all this, but to his utter horror, he saw one of the organizers prodding a laborer to walk faster to keep pace with Gandhi. The Bhatkam speech became a memorable one. In front of a stunned crowd, he calls his marchers and severely rebukes them. He calls all of them unworthy of conducting this satyagraha. He compares all of them with the viceroy who preys on the poor under the guise of helping them. And by the end of this speech, Gandhi nearly breaks down. But in the end, he famously said in his speech that may he die a dog's death, but he will not turn back before Swaraj was won. For the benefit of my friends who understand Gujarati, he said, Kagra kutra ni maut marish, but Swaraj nahi mare tyan sudhi pacho nahi karo. This is inside the Bhatkam school. The area inside the village of Kapletha, by which Gandhi was received. The plan was for the marchers to cross this village, and there is a small river on the banks of which this village is, and they had to cross this river on foot. But as luck would have it, on that fateful day, the currents of the river were too rapid, making it impossible for the marchers to cross on foot, and there were no boats available. In such moments of crisis, the villagers of Kapletha came out with an ingenious solution. They rowed their bullock carts into the river, unyoked the animals, arranged the carts in a straight line, and thus created a bridge out of bullock carts. And all the marchers, including Gandhi, hopped from one cart to the other and crossed the river. This is the river Mindora, site of Gandhi's cart bridge. And finally, we reach Dandi. This is the Dandi beach as it looked in '83. Dr. Weber told me that during his trip there was absolutely nothing there. In the few trips that I made, there were hordes of tourists on the beach. Site of Gandhi's last speech of the march. The selfie villa where Gandhi stayed in Dandi. This historic house was donated to the nations by the descendants of Seth Sirajuddin. When Nehru visited this place in 1961. This is inside the Saifi Villa room on the first floor where Gandhi spent the last night of the march. It is said that such was the energy that night that no one in the entire village except for Gandhi could sleep. Gandhi wakes up at 3 in the morning. At 6 he conducts his prayers, and by 6:30 he declares having broken the salt law. This is the memorial that marks the point from which Gandhi picks up a fistful of salt. This is right outside the Saifi Villa towards the beach. This is how it looks today. Now, if you look carefully, there's this engraving of Gandhi bending down to pick up salt. This is based on the famous picture that all of us have seen of Gandhi. Now, I would like to play the spoilsport here by telling you that that famous picture was not taken at Dandi. It was taken 2 days after the event, 50 kilometers away from the beach of Dandi, in a village called Bhimrad, where there was absolutely no salt. Gandhi was posing for the cameras. Actually, there was no salt that morning on the 6th of April 1930 on the beach of Dandi. And that is because the British government had deployed police who ploughed the salt deposits on the beach of Dandi. And the fistful of salt that Gandhi is supposed to have picked was actually fistful of saline mud. And when salt was extracted from it, it amounted to 2 tolas. Or in other words, 23 grams. And 23 grams of salt was all it took for Gandhi to shake the foundations of the British Empire. Thank you.
There are plenty of protest marches these days. To what extent do they follow the principles of Satyagraha which you have mentioned? The discipline and the simplicity and so on.
See, one of the reasons why we still remember Gandhi and one of the reasons why he's so relevant today is because of what you say. The grace is no longer there. And that is what we have to learn. I suppose that's all one can say.
Anybody else? Yes, please.
Sir, Anuj,
Mic here. Just a minute.
thank you. It was wonderful to do this journey through your visuals and Dr. Nepo's visuals. Thank you so
Hold
much.
the mic closer to you.
Thank you so much for bringing us this innovative ideas and of course the history. एक चीज़ ये मुझे बताइए कि जब आप इन गाँव में गए लोगों से मिले, क्या नई पीढ़ी मतलब जो 25-30 साल के लोग हैं उनके पास वो किस्से हैं, वो कहानियाँ हैं जो आपने older generation से सुने या जिए?
Yeah.
Whether these stories
See,
are
I'll tell you,
disseminating.
most of these places, the villages, these are small villages. And the younger generation has mostly migrated. So we always had an oral tradition of storytelling. And that tradition has been fractured because of this migration. So whatever stories I could gather was from people who were in their 70s or 80s, people from my generation or in the 50s, they were not aware. So that is what it is.
Yes.
Anuj, there is a sculpture near back to Rashtrapati Bhavan of 12 people, Gandhi March. They are the real people of that time, or it was?
No, I don't think they are the real people, but I think there is the new Dandi memorial that has come up in Dandi. They have recreated, supposedly, I don't know, I'm not sure, but the story is that the busts of the marchers that are there are true to life.
अनुज जी, मैं ये पूछना चाहता था, इतनी सारी फोटोग्राफ देखी, उनमें इतनी इम्पोर्टेंट लोकेशंस की इतनी बुरी हालत थी, क्या उसकी कोई वजह पता लगी आपको कि ये आज भी इतनी बुरी हालत क्यों है?
See, I'll tell you the reason for this. Most of these sites that you see are privately owned. Privately as in owned by individuals or trusts, where it is very difficult for someone to do something about it, because the cost of restoration is very high. The other problem is that in lot of these sites there are litigations, there are tenants, making it virtually impossible for someone to do something about it. So I don't know who is to blame for this, but this is what I gathered from my interactions with people.
It's the Gujarat model of development.
Absolutely. Yes.
What was the name of the Seth at whose house Gandhi stayed in Dandi?
Seth Sirajuddin Wasi.
Would that mean he's a Muslim?
Yes.
No, the reason I didn't know this until just now, but I had heard that along with Gandhiji, there was only one Muslim, Abbas Tayyab ji, and possibly one other, and that all the other 77 or so satyagrahis did not belong to the Muslim religion, and that therefore in some ways the Salt Satyagraha presaged the partition of India. What would you have to say about this? Is this in fact factually true?
Well, there were few Muslims in the march. That is a fact.
But you know, at the Sabarmati ashram,
Huh.
there's a list not of 79,
Huh.
but of 72,
Huh.
which I have read through
Huh.
at the ashram.
Huh.
And only Abbas Tayyab ji is an identifiable Muslim.
Yeah. I think there was one more Muslim who had walked. All these marchers were actually handpicked by Gandhi. Now, we don't know what was his criteria, but knowing Gandhi, he would have thought of various things. Gandhi left nothing to randomness, and he was an astute politician. He knew the importance of symbolism like no other politician. So, the reasons behind the choice of satyagrahis is still not known. I mean, I'm not aware, neither have I come across any literature that could throw light on this.
There was some Parsi person also.
Yes, there was Mituban Petit. Yeah.
There was a lathi charge between Dandi and some village.
There was no lathi charge. No lathi charge during. What you say is after the march ended, and you are referring to possibly the Darsana massacre that was there. That was after. After.
And Gandhiji was arrested.
He was arrested from Kareli. I think about 22 days after the march.
There is an interesting book by the name of Salt Story, and I think it is about actually Mithapur, and the salt factory. So, but there is a whole story about this salt satyagraha, where Gandhi stayed and everything, what meats were prepared. And every little detail that is in that book.
It
which
is
I
quite
have-
incredible
it is in
that
Annexe library.
the amount of micromanagement that Gandhi could do. He had prescribed the amount of ghee that
Yes.
every marcher could have.
Yes, exactly.
And what is most remarkable is that, right throughout this march, the marchers were about aged between 20-21 or so. He was 61. And whenever they would reach a destination, the marchers would be tired. Gandhi would be giving speeches and writing. And I've read some of the letters that Gandhi wrote during the Salt March. It is quite surprising that the way this man could think, because I read letters in which he was writing to some lady inquiring about the health of her goat, and to some person he was inquiring about the health. So I don't know how a man could operate on so many levels simultaneously.
Anuj, I think Dr. Ramanohar Lohiya also written his thesis on Salt Marsh on Berlin University after this Salt Marsh.
Okay.
Yes. Well, if there are no questions or comments, yes, go ahead.
Congratulations, Anuj, and for all the members. Actually, a lot of elders are here, but I think as you people are doing, the message that being gone to the youngers. I don't know how to bring the younger generation to know about it, not this particular thing, whether it should come in textbooks or something, because what's happening is we are not aware of it, and people just believe, we don't want to know the history. So because of whatever it is, unemployment, or people just want to earn money. See, I don't know, it's not easy for you. You should have worked on it, so much of money spending, people around, moving around, your family and things. So how many of us, from places where the rural, though they want to know, how many of them will be able to do? So how do we show this to the children?
I will tell you something. When I did this project, when I took up this project, it was not to change the face of a nation or to do some good for the society. It was purely done for my own curiosity. I was very curious and I did this, right? What needs to be taught at the school levels is to instigate curiosity in children. That's about it.
So, very nice answer, because I just work in and I have a foundation, and it so happened that I'm here just for a visit or something, and I came to know this. I just saw that, so I cancelled my outgoing and I wanted to listen to that, because my husband's grandfather was also part of this, and he was from Karnataka, so he was with him. And I'm basically an assistant professor, so it took for me nearly 9 years. I'm into social service, leaving my job. So it was like, he was the first chief minister of Karnataka. So, I didn't want to promote, but there's nothing of his in the entire state of Karnataka. So it took 5 years for me to put up a small statue of his in Vidhana Sauda. It was just one signature which was required. So I'm like, where is the information gone now? How Gandhi brought independence to the entire country under his leadership. We got independence on October 24th, which my state people don't know, which my leaders don't know, so I'm like, how do the basic knowledge, how Bengaluru became the capital city, Vidhana Sauda started when, the basic information, it's so very difficult, and for us to do any such promotion or just to bring it, to the people that this is how our freedom struggle was. Each one gave of, as you mentioned, through the walk, 3 acres, 5 acres. Those days they have given 3, 8, 5 acres without having nothing to eat. Just think today our politicians or people over, how much do they have it? How much we could do. So I'm like, at least let the young generation feel that we don't need so much. Come on, let's do something for our country, for our people. I don't know, I'm working on that, so thank you. I'm excellent. I'm happy to be here, and I don't know, on behalf of everybody, I really thank you so very much. Thank you.
Well, we are trying from the Raza Foundation in this, oh, you are, yeah, please.
I had minor suggestion. These photographs, I saw them. there is something very moving about the whole story. But the photographs by themselves do not convey that. Your comments convey that. Now, you are not omnipresent and others are not omniscient. So I would request you to convert this into a commentary and keep this along with the photographs.
No, the photographs that were exhibited, there's an exhibition that travels of these photographs. And beneath each photograph, there is a caption that captures the essence of the history. The other thing that I also don't like to do is to spoon feed people. So if I mention everything, then the magic of viewing a picture and experiencing a picture and then going back home and making inquiries about what these pictures are, that goes away. So there is also something that one has to do to instigate people to get involved with something. So that my whole criteria is to just leave at a point where a person gets interested and inquisitive, and then leave it at that, and then it is up to
one document, which also has your voice narrating it. Nobody is omnipresent.
Just call me and I'll speak with you.
Well, as I was saying, in a small way, the Raza Foundation, by organizing Gandhi Matters, is trying to rehabilitate memory and to rehabilitate what is being totally eroded in the current political scenario, and to bring at least some of you back to remember what a glorious freedom struggle we had, and what a great person we are now busy denigrating on a daily basis. So this is an attempt to undo that to the extent we can. But should a documentary of this kind be made, we will be willing to support it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Go and have your salt now. Every time each one of you takes a bit of salt, you will remember how it mattered at one time in the freedom struggle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anuj, may I?
Thank you so much.